Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Monday, February 10th, 2020 meeting. Board of Selectmen, Highway Commissioners, Cemetery Commissioners. First order of business is please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Good evening, everyone. As you can see, we're short a couple members. Mr. Massey is unavailable. Mr. Joseph would like to be dialed in. Has to be done by a roll call vote, but at this time, the chair will entertain a motion to allow remote participation for Mr. Joseph.
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Johnson. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Siganovich. Roll call vote. Mr. Johnson.
Jay Johnson, aye.
Mr. Siganovich.
Harry Siganovich, aye.
Stephen Sullivan, aye. Unanimous. Give us 30 seconds, please, to call Paul in.
Almost got his roll call. Good evening, Paul. How are you? Good, thanks. I'm going to put you on speakerphone, and you will be here. Sure.
Good evening, Paul.
Good evening, Sally. Good evening, Jay.
Good evening.
First up on the board of business is the minutes from January 27, 2020. What is the board's pleasure?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion that we accept the minutes of January 27th, 2020.
Presented.
Second.
Motion made by Mr. Siganovich, seconded by Mr. Joseph. Any questions, concerns, or corrections? Hearing none, all in favor, state aye.
Aye.
Roll call vote.
Yep, roll call.
Jay Johnson, aye.
Mr. Siganovich.
Harry Siganovich, aye.
Paul.
Paul Joseph, aye.
Stephen Sullivan, aye, unanimous. Executive session minutes, January 27, 2020. Mr. Administrator, is this issue closed?
Well, it is closed. There'll be another bite of the apple with this, but it'll be covered under the next set of minutes. You can release these minutes.
Release. Chair will entertain a motion to release the executive session minutes of January 27, 2020.
So moved.
Mr. Siganovich moved.
Second.
Second by Mr. Johnson. Roll call vote. Mr. Johnson.
Jay Johnson, aye.
Mr. Siganovich.
Harry Siganovich, aye.
Paul.
Paul Joseph, aye.
Stephen Sullivan, aye. So released. Next up, appointments. Election workers. Appoint the following election workers for term to expire October 7, 2020. Leslie Mantos, Maureen O'Connor, Cheryl Bernardo, Marlene Sepatelli. What's the board's pleasure?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion that we appoint, with the term to expire October 7th, 2020, Leslie Manthos, Maureen O'Connor, Cheryl Bernardo, and Marlene Sepatelli.
Second.
Motion made, Mr. Siganovich, seconded by Mr. Johnson. Roll call vote. Mr. Siganovich.
Harry Siganovich, aye.
Paul.
Paul Joseph, aye.
Mr. Johnson.
Jay Johnson, aye.
Stephen Sullivan, aye. Unanimous. Thank you.
The town clerk wanted all of them to be reappointed at once in October, so.
So we don't have a stagger.
Please approach the microphone if you want to question the actions of the chair. We like that. We like to see you back. Rather see you back than your front. Public comments, citizen comments. Anybody wishing to be heard, not on the agenda, not requiring a vote of the board? Seeing none. Town administrator report. Mr. Ruda.
I'll try to keep this one short based on a pretty lengthy agenda, Mr. Chairman. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. we start our cybersecurity vulnerability assessment under the grant we secured, and we'll be meeting with department heads. The vendor that we hired, True North, will...
Lloyd, what the hell is that? Sorry.
It's okay.
has different ways of vocalizing.
That's okay.
Yes, address
We
the
got people in the crowd
microphone.
like that, too.
Okay.
So you gonna address the microphone?
Okay.
Oh, Doc.
Oh, the dog. Go ahead, Gary. I mean, Jonathan.
I know what it was. What?
True North will be here at 10 a.m. tomorrow to kick off our 3 or 4 week vulnerability study. They're going to be setting up in the town accountant's office. I scheduled a department head meeting at 10 a.m. tomorrow so that the department heads can understand what the scope of work is going to be and talk about access to their different buildings, including their networks. And there will be a complete report on the findings in executive session to the Board of Selectmen when it's completed. Our ADA grant, the bids have been received. The bidding period is closed. We received 2 qualified bids, and we'll make that decision probably within the next week as to who's going to have that work. And the Camden Partners. The Camden Partners are the people who are interested in Stevens Linen. So on last Friday, Bill Scanlon, Lisa Berg, our town council, Carolyn Murray, and I met with Camden Partners, and their council determined where we stood with a plan to amend our Mill Overlay District bylaw to allow for a waiver to allow the Stevens Mill project to progress with 100% market rate housing. So the hang-up and the slowdown and the challenge has been that under our Mill Overlay District bylaw requirements, we are to have 10% low-income or affordable housing in these districts. That's a deal breaker for Camden. So we've come up with a proposal to amend our existing zoning bylaw to allow for a waiver by the planning board upon the recommendation of the Board of Selectmen to allow for that use during the time that they apply for a special permit. So within the next week, I'll have a draft copy of that proposed bylaw amendment for the board to take a look at, and at that point, we're going to have a public, we'll have a public meeting. We'll ask the planning board to come in, economic development, Board of Selectmen, and hear what the Camden Partners project is, so everybody has a good overview of it. I think this is a pretty good solution to, not only for this project, but for future projects that might qualify for this kind of redevelopment. Part of the criteria that will be, the planning board would consider is if it will preserve some or all of the historic building, if the site is suitable for the proposed use, whether it serves social, economic, or community needs, if it's compatible with the character of the neighboring properties, if it impacts the town's fiscal responsibilities, including impact on town services, tax base, and employment, and if the Board of Selectmen has submitted a written recommendation in favor of granting the waiver. And I think that just by involving the Board of Selectmen and all the departments that fall under the Board of Selectmen or are appointed by the Board of Selectmen, such as Economic Development, Planning, FAA, that gives us a real opportunity to take, well, a few members of the FAA. It gives us the opportunity to really take a good look as to what the scope of the project is and make a good, and have a really good overview before we send a recommendation forward to the planning board to vote on a waiver. It also kind of forces communication between all the departments in advance of granting any sort of a waiver. So in some cases, it may work for the town as adjudged by the Board of Selectmen. In other cases, it may not be a good fit. So this gives us an opportunity to be the trigger or to be the extinguishing authority in terms of thinking of granting a waiver for something like this.
Excellent.
What else? And like I said, I mentioned earlier, I'll send out a draft zoning bylaw amendment for your review, and then we'll put a joint meeting on the books to have a presentation from Camden. And now we're getting to the point we're going to start talking about negotiating an agreement with Camden. So at that point, I think we're going to start asking members of that task force that we put together a few months ago to join us in that kind of discussion. And that's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Any questions of the town administrator? Paul, any questions?
No, not a question, a comment. I want to commend Mr. Ruda for coming up with a solution that is clearly in the benefit and the interest of the town. I don't know if any prior administrators would have been able to find that kind of solution. So I'm grateful and appreciative, and I want to commend them for it.
Thank you. Any questions from the crowd on that? Hearing none. Accept the administrator's report as read into the record. Around town, focus on local businesses. We're going to talk about it. We're going to try to crank that up again. License and permits, we have none. Public hearing, we have none. Old business, we have none. New business, 10A. Linda Bazinet, Black Tavern, permission to use the town common for the 8th, is that correct? 8th Annual Craft Fair. On Saturday, October 3rd, 2020, right around the corner. Good evening, Mrs. Bazinet. Always a pleasure to see you.
My pleasure to be here. They all left me.
Yeah. Take a step forward.
Yeah. It's very clear, the Black Tavern, our big fundraiser every year, and it's getting bigger every year, is our craft fair in October. And we'd like to use the common again. In years past, we've had maybe low 30s participants, but because of internet, Facebook, whatever you call it, it's all out there. We're receiving a lot of applications already, and we're probably going to have to limit it to 50 crafters. It's growing that much. So we very much would like to use the common for our crafters. Now, I know Mr. Joseph is sitting at home saying, what am I going to do about my farmers? Well, Mr. Duchamp today went to the common, and he's mapped it all out. We can fit our 50 crafters. We're probably going to limit it to that for our own benefit. Dave Prue from the Historic Commission, again, is bringing in the artisans. He always hates when I call them crafters. Artisans from Old Sturbridge Village. Mm-hmm. So they will have that part of the common. We'll use, I don't know if you can see that, the front part, and we have spaces for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, well, I'll put them as farmers, but local, you know. I don't think last year, I think they only had a couple come.
Put that in the middle, we can get it down. So,
Up.
yeah, just slide it up a little.
Tell me where.
Right there, put it straight down. Yep. Nope. All right, don't move. Fred will get it.
Don't move, yeah, let him do it. So anyhow,
So can you just show the what you have reserved for
yeah,
outside?
we have these 2 rows of crafters for the Black Tavern.
Yep.
That's a farmer, and then Dave Prue's artisans from Old Sturbridge Village.
Okay.
And we can, actually, we'll probably be adding a couple of crafters on our side to account for everybody.
Perfect.
So I know it's early, but these things
Oh, no, it takes a lot of
have
work.
to take a lot of work and planning, so that's why I'm here to ask for the use of the common.
Jonathan, no problems on the town side, right?
No problems on the town side. I think that's a reasonable solution to
Anybody?
accommodate everyone.
Excellent. Any questions for Mrs. Bazinet?
Yes.
Paul?
Will the Agricultural Commission, and by the way, they're not my farmers, they're the town's farmers, will the Agricultural Commission and town farmers have access to the same amount of space that they did this past October?
Yes.
Yes.
Actually,
Okay, then I have no problems with it.
Actually, they're reserving them more spaces than they used last year.
I think there is more space than they used last year.
Yep.
Well, then in that case, I want to thank Linda and the committee for that consideration, and I think it's important that we all continue to work together. It has the potential to become bigger, certainly, or as big as the Strawberry Festival down the road. But thank you, Linda.
Well, you're welcome. We'd love to see it keep growing, but there's only so much space. But we'll make it work.
You move it down to the stadium, maybe Nichols let us use the football field.
Right. I do have a email into Nichols I forgot what her actual title is, but anyhow, to use the 1805 lot again for parking, because that works well for our crafters and for people coming.
Lynn Luby?
Beg your pardon?
Probably Lynn Luby? Is that who?
No, Kathy Champagne,
Oh, okay.
yeah. But I haven't heard back from her, but I'll follow up on that.
Excellent. Any other questions for Mrs. Bazinet? Hearing none, the chair will entertain the request to use the town common on October 3rd, 2020 for the 8th Annual Craft Fair, the time being,
Well, it's 10 to 3 is the actual craft fair, so crafters usually start coming around 7:30, 8 o'clock.
8 to 5. You want that?
Once they break down, it's amazing. And we'll probably, again, use the high school, National Honor. Students come and help in the morning to set up, help them, move stuff, lunchtime, and then they come and help at breakdown. And they've been wonderful. It's really nice. The crafters really appreciate it.
You did all the heavy lifting, now he's coming up.
Yeah.
I just want to clarify that the Tradesmen on a Common program runs from 9:30 to 3:30.
Oh.
It's a 6-hour program. It's a little bit longer than the craft fair.
So wait, about 8 to 5 then, maybe? That way give people plenty of time to clean up. Is that okay with the board, 8 to 5?
Yes.
So moved.
So moved.
Second.
Second. Roll call vote. Mr. Sigenovich.
Gary Sigenovich, aye.
Paul.
Paul Joseph, aye.
Mr. Johnson.
Jay Johnson, aye.
Stephen Sullivan, aye. Good luck.
Thank you. Hope to
Unanimous.
see you there.
It's tough for me on a Saturday at work. The mail must go through.
Send your wife.
To deliver the mail?
No, to the craft
I
fair.
thought you wanted to see me.
Well, I do, but, if you have to work, send somebody with a nice big pocketbook.
That's the thing, I love going there, I love going there every year. It's a cheap date as long as nobody buys any.
I know it, and it's nice to see what the crafters can do.
It is.
Thank you. Next up, Board of Selectmen, introduction of DJ Jacobs Consulting, the successful bidder to conduct a salary survey and associated work. BOS will briefly review example documents, timeline, and be shown examples of what to expect the finished product. Good evening, sir.
Samples of finished product.
Mr.
What
Administrator.
to expect from the finished product.
I'm an
Mr. Chair-
example.
Mr. Chairman, this is Don Jacobs. He's the vendor that was selected to complete our salary survey, and he's already hit the ground running, and we've begun with some of the initial paperwork
Excellent.
that was distributed. We had a staff meeting. We distributed the paperwork at that point where Mr. Jacobs can get an idea as to what the responsibilities are, and marry those responsibilities up with both an interview with the staff member and a copy of the job description. And I thought we'd have Don come in tonight and kind of give an overview of his process and answer any questions that the board may have.
Excellent. First off, on behalf of the town, welcome, Mr. Jacobs. If you
Thank
want
you.
to take a brief synopsis of who you are, what you have, and,
Keyword being brief.
well,
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to be here. As the town administrator indicated, the project's underway. I think I was last here a couple weeks ago. Had an opportunity to meet with a good number of the employees that are part of the study. And really what I'm sharing with you tonight, I shared with them. And I think the reason why I begin by saying that to you is that in doing a study of this nature, it's been my experience, and I've been doing this now for about 20 years, there's probably nothing relative to local government that's harder than to try to manage compensation effectively. And what I mean by effectively, I really mean, managing how you pay positions and pay employees, and being able to do this, and I believe you got in your packet a one-page handout.
Yep.
Which, once again, we distributed to all the employees. I'd like to give you this because this really, I think, in one document, gives you a good understanding of what the purpose of the study is, what's called the goal of the study, and then secondly, what are the 3 objectives that are specifically being proposed in order to accomplish the goal or consistent with the purpose of the study. So a goal, by definition, means it's ongoing unless you just don't do something. In this case, what we're talking about, obviously, is paying positions and paying employees. And I've indicated in the goal statement in italics what I think are 2 of the significant, what I call criteria or standards, if you want, to managing compensation. The first one, as it says here, is to do so fairly, which really means consistently. And secondly, to do so equitably, which, as it points out in the statement, means competitive. So when we're talking about paying positions or paying employees, what I'm suggesting to you that the two standards that we're always trying to meet are to do this consistently and to do this competitively. Another word for consistent really is to be able to explain it so that everyone understands what the process is. I always like to begin by emphasizing that we're talking about both internal equity, how positions and employees compare to one another within the town of Dudley, and at the same time, we're also talking about how positions and employees compare to the marketplace. So that no matter what aspect of compensation we're talking about, whether it's paying an employee and or paying a position, the two standards to keep in mind are to try to do so consistently and then to try to do so competitively. Doesn't mean you have to. Nothing says you shall do this in any particular way, but if you're not going to do this consistently, or if you're not going to develop a process to determine whether you're paying an employee and or a position competitively, you should have a reason why not. All right? And so that's the purpose of the study. You notice what I haven't said at this point, I haven't brought up the issue of cost. One of the common misunderstandings and what makes managing compensation, frankly, so difficult in local government is that the process that I've just outlined you, the purpose of doing the study, the reason why I'm here this evening, is to do a study to establish a process, again, that meets the standards of consistency and competitiveness, and then you're able to determine, based on what you can afford, how do you want to spend the money. So one of the misconceptions oftentimes when they hear that there's a quote-unquote compensation study that's going to be done, right away you associate that with cost. Well, we can't afford it, or we can afford, or something along those lines. I would submit to you that's not the purpose of the study. Once you've developed a process to pay positions and employees, that by and in itself doesn't cost the town any money. But once you've developed that process, once you have a so-called plan in place that you're comfortable with as a Board of Selectmen, the employees are comfortable means we all understand it. Then you're able to develop a process to pay employees, both to hire someone and then secondly to retain them. Okay, so I intentionally try to put this whole kind of issue of compensation, I think, in its proper perspective. Any questions about the purpose of the study? And sometimes when I say, well, you know, it isn't really about the cost, well, of course we're going to pay someone, well, therefore we're going to incur a cost. All I'm saying to you, it's about how you get to the cost, not where you start from, but where you end up, all right, once you've developed a way to pay positions and pay employees. So the three objectives you see listed on the handout, those are the three specific things. When I use the word objective, I'm talking about something that's specific, measurable, and time-bound, as opposed to, again, a goal statement that basically doesn't have a predetermined ending. So the first thing, and these are in chronological or in order of importance, frankly, the first thing that we're doing, and we've already started, as the town administrator mentioned, is to write a quote-unquote accurate job description. And when I use the word accurate, as it says in the objective statement, accurate means two things. It means describing where someone spends the bulk of their time today, not necessarily every single thing they do. In fact, it doesn't mean to do that. But what are the most important things that someone today is required to do, with the understanding that tomorrow they may do something different, or yesterday they did something different, and so on. So what we're focused on is today. So when we ask an employee to tell us, well, where do you spend the bulk of your time, we're asking them to tell us based on what they're doing right now. Okay? And the second part of accuracy is to describe what are referred to as the minimum qualifications for a position. And minimum qualifications really means the knowledge, the skill, the ability someone needs to do what they're required to do. You notice I use the word required. It's what the town requires an employee to do, and what the town establishes as the minimum qualifications to carry out those responsibilities, those essential functions. Okay? All of that information needs to be put into a job description, so that one of the purposes of the job description going forward, which is not the case today, your current descriptions really, in my opinion, just aren't quote-unquote accurate. They don't meet those two standards of necessarily describing today what someone's required to do, and they don't really describe in as much detail as they should, as you'll see when you look at the draft descriptions, what the knowledge, ability, and skill is that each individual is required to have in order to carry out their job duties. It's a fairly detailed, straightforward process in writing a job description, an accurate job description. It starts with asking the employee to tell us where they spend the bulk of their time and what, in their opinion, are the minimum qualifications. Then at the same time, and we do that by asking them to fill out a questionnaire, which they've now done, with a few exceptions, but basically almost 100% of the employees that are involved in the study have now filled out a questionnaire. We've now written a draft job description, and we're in the process of sending those draft job descriptions back to the employees. And at that point, we'll come back and meet with them. So the first, in writing an accurate job description, frankly, what's so important, probably the most important part of the whole study, frankly, is to take the time to talk to your employees, to give them ample opportunity to tell us, one, what they think they do, where they spend the bulk of their time, and secondly, what, in their opinion, are the minimum qualifications. So we take the time to come back and meet with them. They'll have the draft before we meet with them. We'll meet with them to review that draft, and if nothing else, also be able to explain to them the process that we're following, and hopefully they understand it. And then we'll go back and make any adjustments or changes that they might request, and then we'll send it back to them for a second time. And at the second step, we also then ask them, once they've reviewed it again, to provide it to their department head or to their supervisor, for the department head or supervisor to tell us what he or she thinks as well. And as I've explained to the employees, and I'll mention to you as well, the check and balance that's built into the process, when we explain that to the employees, we follow the lead of the manager initially. So when we get back the job descriptions, it's the manager that tells us ultimately what the employee is required to do. But again, I think it's important to emphasize so the board understands that we're not asking anyone, no employee, we're not asking any department head to approve a job description. What we are asking them to do is to tell us what they think is accurate. So there is a difference. In fact, as I've explained to the employees, and I'll mention again to the board, you're the only ones that approve a job description. The town approves the job description, not the employee. So if you have any questions, concerns about, well, employees might use this as an opportunity to, knowing that this is ultimately going to determine how their position is being paid, they might use it as an opportunity to say whatever they want. Well, that just frankly doesn't happen. And the reason why it doesn't happen is it doesn't make sense. So this process is really about doing this in a consistent way, which really means common sense driven. Okay? Once we've completed the first objective, which we hope to have done basically within another week, maybe 2 weeks at the most, we'll then be able to use those job descriptions as a basis. So I'll have a document in front of me that I know both the employee and the department head have seen, and particularly they've both had a chance to tell me what they feel is accurate. Based on those draft descriptions, then we'll use them as a basis to compare positions to one another. And in doing so, develop what is referred to as a classification plan. And I say that to you this evening because currently the town does not have a classification plan. So one of the reasons why I wanted to meet with you early on in this study is to give you a heads up relative to what ultimately is going to come out of this study. So one of the results of the study, one of the products, so to speak, if you want to call it that, is a classification plan. That's part of the plan that we are in the process now of developing. Classification plan, if you probably are familiar with it, basically consists of grade levels and salary ranges. And I'll touch on the salary part in a minute. So the grade level part, this classification level part, is primarily determined by how you write the job descriptions. It's not primarily determined by the market data or any other dollars and cents for that matter. That's one, again, of the misunderstandings, frankly, with regard to developing a classification plan. The check and balance to the second objective, just as there is a check and balance to the first objective, basically is your organizational structure. So in developing the grade level structure, what we keep in mind and what obviously you need to be aware of is today how positions are organized within the town of Dudley and how they report to one another, from the highest level responsibility basically down to the lowest level and everything that's in between. So what I'm suggesting to you tonight is when you see the classification plan and you look at the grade level structure, not the dollars and cents, the simple answer to whether the grade level structure is accurate is really based on your organizational structure, both within a particular department as well as the town as a whole. And again, I think it's important to emphasize tonight we're only talking about non-union positions. And in saying non-union positions, what I really mean by that is we're talking about, quote unquote, what I call regular positions, The word regular means where you require an employee to work at least 52 weeks a year. That's what I mean by the word regular. So, as you know from looking at your salary schedule, you have some employees that work 40 hours a week, some work 32, some work 16, 12, and so on. The primary characteristic that defines the word regular, and therefore the position should be in this study, one, they're non-union, but secondly, they're regular positions, okay? So full-time, part-time, you can be full-time, right, a so-called full-time regular position, but you can also be part-time. Other kinds of positions where the employee is not required to work 52 weeks a year are what we would typically refer to as temporary positions. And you can either be temporary part-time, you can be seasonal. In other words, temporary means you pay someone when you require them to work. They're not scheduled to work 52 weeks a year. And hopefully, that distinction is clear for you. So the first two objectives you see, writing the job descriptions, developing the classification or grade plan, once again, doesn't cost the town any money. Once we've completed that second objective, what I've suggested to the town administrator, that's a good opportunity for us to come back and show you what we've done to date, is to show you a classification plan, not the dollars and cents, but how we've gotten the grade level structure, if for no other reason because, that's something new. You haven't seen it before. It's critically important. It's absolutely essential to developing a classification plan that you as a board are comfortable knowing how it's been done. If for no other reason, then you're able to maintain it going forward. And that's always, by the way, one of my real concerns. Having done this now for the past 20 years, one of the unfortunate situations that happens all too frequently, frankly, some of your neighboring towns, I won't mention, but nonetheless, it happens pretty regularly, where a city or a town will go through this process, establish a plan today, and at the same time not establish the process in writing to maintain the plan. So one of the things I wanted to mention to you this evening is for you to keep in mind, once you see a plan, what we're also going to ask you to do as a board is to approve a set of policies or guidelines, if you want to call it that describe how the plan was developed. So in doing so, you have something in writing going forward that tells everyone how you pay positions and secondly, how you pay employees, okay? So with that classification plan in place, again, classification meaning grade levels, we then need to add to it the salary ranges, as I mentioned a minute ago. That's where we do survey the marketplace. So the objective there is to survey other quote-unquote comparable entities, public entities, because that's who you primarily compete with, based on essentially, and I will recommend to you municipalities or other public entities to survey, and I've asked department heads and employees for their input, just to ask them if they have any concerns or thoughts in that regard, and I'll ask you to think about the same thing, but I will come back and I will recommend to you a set of how to conduct the market study, basically, the purpose of which is obviously to collect enough data on a position-by-position basis, and using both operational criteria as well as demographic criteria, not just demographic. If I've learned anything about collecting market data that's as creditable as possible, is to also use operational criteria. So what I do as a town clerk in the town of Dudley may not be the same as a town clerk in another community. There's no necessarily guarantee that although statutorily they have similar responsibilities, but departments are organized differently. It really depends on the community or the municipality. So in using both operational and demographic criteria, what I've learned, particularly the operational aspect of it, is a way to collect data that is as creditable as possible. In other words, that you're comfortable using. And when we get to that point, we'll come back and we'll show you not only who we've surveyed, but more importantly, how we recommend using the market data to help us develop ranges. So in developing the salary ranges, and I mentioned the word competitive earlier as being one of the standards that we want to meet, whether we're talking about an employee and or a position, we actually use 3 criteria to define the word competitive, not just the market data. And that's one of the concerns I have about your current plan today, is you're primarily using market data, and that's the only criteria that I can tell anyway that you're probably using today. The other 2 criteria we use are the rate of pay of the employee, whatever that might be today, and then thirdly, how long the employee has been in their current position. So years of service, frankly, in a position is one of the, again, common sense, so to speak, criteria that can be used very effectively, meaning in a consistent way to define the word competitive. And you'll see all that relative to once we've collected the market data. The town administrator has already given me a list of all the current rates of pay, when everyone's been appointed in their current position. I have all that information. The only thing I don't have yet is the market data, which we're now in the process of starting to collect. So once we've collected that market data in addition to the rate of pay of employees and how long they've been in their respective current positions, and it's in the current position, not necessarily total years of service, which typically might be referred to as longevity. We're only concerned about where they are today. And that's what we're using as a basis to determine whether or not, again, either the employee and or their position is either currently being paid competitively or going forward, you'll be able to determine, based on those three criteria, essentially where you go from here relative to defining that word competitive. So my objective in presenting a quote-unquote plan to you, which again means grade levels and salary ranges, is really then to enable you, based on what you can afford, which is obviously part of your budgetary process, it gives you then the opportunity to decide what's the best way to spend the money. All right, so you haven't asked me, that's not part of my study, to determine what the town of Dudley can or cannot afford to spend, frankly, on anything. But what I think I am here to do is to help you develop a process, a way to spend that money, in other words, to both hire an employee as well as to retain a current employee, and to do so meeting the two basic standards that I've mentioned now several times: consistency and competitiveness. Okay? And that essentially is the study. It's really not meant to be, frankly, any more complicated than that. With a plan like this in place, once again, with a process in writing, so that everyone understands in the town of Dudley how you manage compensation, then you're able to make that determination about what you can afford, really as a separate so-called budgetary issue, and then in doing so decide what's the best way to spend the money. And you and I both know, and everyone understands, there's lots of ways to spend money. All right? My objective basically is to get you to that point where you're comfortable having that conversation and making those kinds of decisions separate from, or I guess you could say in addition to, the process to determine how to pay a position and then how to pay your current employees. So obviously they're joined at the hip. They're related to one another, to put it mildly, but I would suggest it really is a one step at a time process that gets you to then how to spend the money. And unfortunately, what typically happens in a pay plan like you have today, which is dollars and cent driven, is that you jump right to the bottom line and you decide based on how much you can afford, well, here's what we're going to spend. And what's not typically part of the process or the conversation, so to speak, is, well, what are we requiring this employee to know how to do? What skill are we requiring them to have? And then what are the different ways to spend the money? Okay? And so with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to answer any questions, concerns. I guess overall time frame wise, just to put this in perspective for you, as I mentioned, within a couple of weeks, we will have completed the first objective, which is the writing of an accurate job description. During the next couple of weeks, then I will come back and I'll sit down with the town administrator and I'll walk him through, as well as meet, I think, with the personnel board at some point, to explain to him how the classification process is designed to work, so that when a so-called classification plan comes back before you, you'll know that both your employees, your personnel board, and particularly your town administrator are comfortable with the process that's been developed. And then it'll enable you to give you an opportunity to look at that draft plan before you see a dollars and cent plan. Overall, time frame wise, those two objectives, the first two objectives, should be completed within about another month.
Mr. Chairman?
So that from a practical standpoint, depending upon how long it takes to collect the market data, you'll have a completed so-called draft classification compensation plan within about a month and a half.
Perfect. Thank you for the presentation.
My pleasure.
In the very beginning, when I said be brief, I meant be brief, tell us a little bit about yourself. I didn't mean be brief.
Oh, about that?
Yeah, I was going to give you time, but I meant be brief.
Yeah, I jumped right over there, didn't I?
That's right.
If you have any questions about who my background, I already mentioned I've done this now for about 20 years. I always like to introduce myself as saying, I've been in the business of local government for about 40. I've been a town manager in a prior lifetime, in the interest of full disclosure. if you're curious as to, well, where was he a town manager? Started in Amherst, spent about 4 years in Southbridge, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and then wound up my managerial career in Plymouth. And back in 2000, basically formed my own company, and I've now done about, believe it or not, about 150 of these so-called classification compensation studies. You know, three-quarters of them have been here in Massachusetts or in New England. So the bulk of my work is right here in this state, but I've had the opportunity to do this kind of work literally up and down the East Coast. And as a result of that experience, frankly, I've seen a lot of different ways to manage compensation. And that's really what I try to bring to you.
Paul, I'm going to recommend.
Chairman,
Yeah, go ahead, Paul.
you know, I gotta tell you, I've been waiting for this guy to take a breath. Now, Mr. Jacobs, you did say up front that this was a straightforward process.
Correct.
And I, for one, prefer and appreciate a straightforward presentation. And I appreciate the length to which you went. But beyond that, I have no questions other than, very simply, when are you going to finish this? And just approximate date.
Yeah, and again, I think as I indicated, Mr. Chairman, my estimated completion date is roughly within about a month and a half.
He's estimating about 6 weeks, Paul.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Mr. Johnson?
A few things. The first being years of service. I always think back to the example, let's say the town administrator has been in his position for 50 years. Would you be recommending that the pay necessarily go up every year, or would you recommend there be a cap? Because, for instance, a position would only, on the open market, be competitive at a certain range. So would you be recommending as many years of service to not cap a position?
Well, I think what I'm suggesting is that years of service is a viable criteria to use to determine how to pay an employee, and to do so, quote-unquote, competitively. There is no automatic, or nor should there be, in my opinion, any cap, so to speak. The practical common sense aspect of competitiveness, if you look at it from the standpoint of when you hire a new employee, any employee, within a quote-unquote reasonable period of time, you reach a point where either the employee feels he or she now has X number of years' experience and therefore is more competitive with the marketplace, or you reach a point where, based on what I'm required to do in working for, let's say, the town of Dudley, and I know what other employees are required to do, whether I feel I'm being paid competitively internally in comparison to what other employees are required to do becomes part of that process. So the word competitive, as I mentioned earlier, is both internal and external. All I'm suggesting is that from a policy standpoint, which is obviously what the Board of Selectmen establishes, one of the policies that I'm going to ask you to think about establishing is to define a period of time that you feel is reasonable in determining whether or not you hire an employee competitively. Now, when you go to hire a new employee, you and I both know how you decide what rate of pay to start an employee at. You may or may not know is competitive or not, because it's not really part of your process. It may be, in one individual situation, it may not be in another. The point is, it's not being done consistently. All I'm suggesting is that, both in terms of establishing a process to pay a new employee, competitiveness is part of that decision-making process, just as it will be going forward relative to how you're currently paying existing employees. Now, whether you're paying them today, I'm going to give you a report, simple Excel spreadsheet, that's going to show you every single employee that's currently working for the town of Dudley that's part of this study, and in my opinion, whether or not today they're being paid competitively based on the 3 criteria that I've already mentioned: market data, their current rate of pay, and how long each of the individual employees has been in their current position. By using those three criteria, not just one, not just market data, it becomes a more common sense, more sensible way to define the word competitive. It gives you more flexibility than to decide whether you want to or not. You don't have to pay anyone competitively. Nothing says you shall do that. All I'm suggesting is that as the hiring authority, you should at least know what you're doing. So you can make the conscious decision as a board, both in terms of when you hire a new employee, and then secondly, in terms of how you retain current employees, whether or not you're paying them competitively today, and then make the last decision, the last part of the study. Once you know where everyone is today, both employee-wise and position-wise, then you can decide how you want to spend money going forward. So that one of the criteria, if you really stop and think about what I'm saying to you tonight, that I'm trying to introduce for you to use is competitiveness. Some of your employees today, I can assure you, are being paid competitively. If you've been granting, as I know you have, a basic, what you might be calling cost of living adjustment every year. Last year, I believe the increase was, what, 2%?
2.
That, by the way, is the magic number out there. I don't know why municipalities typically, in the last several years, have used 2% as a guide, if not the actual percentage amount of increase. But you've been granting regular, quote-unquote, adjustments to salaries on a regular, ongoing basis. And I don't know what the past history has been, but chances are pretty good, if you've been doing that, which I think you have, then you've probably kept up with the market. It really gets back to how you define that word competitive. And you'll see how I recommend doing it. One of the things I'm trying to avoid in doing so is to avoid the temptation to fixate on one number and say, well, if we're not paying that person X amount of dollars, we're not paying him or her competitively. That's not the way I'm going to recommend you do it. So flexibility, to give you the flexibility as the hiring authority, to give you the flexibility in terms of what you can afford, is really a critical aspect of this plan that you'll see that will be presented to you, so that you feel you always have the flexibility or the option to determine what's in the town's best interest.
Mr. Chairman, is it just that, because I think I know what Mr. Johnson is asking, may have been answered already, but I think the concern was there a salary range. In other words, for example, the police chief has a young clerk. He just hired her less than a year ago.
Mm-hmm.
If she decides she wants to be the police chief's clerk for the next 30 years, is she going to make as much salary as the incoming new police chief is, just by virtue of the fact that she's been there for 30 years?
No.
Or are we going to have a salary range saying,
No.
this is what a clerk one makes?
The answer is
You
no.
get cost of living or whatever the.
That's right. No,
going
the answer is
forward
no,
happens to
very
be.
simply because they're not the same positions. They don't have the same level of, so the positions themselves wouldn't be classified at the same grade level because they have clearly defined different levels of responsibility.
No, I understand that. I understand that. So every grade would have its own min and max, maybe an overlap as you go up.
That's right.
But, you know, the example, trying to think of an example without ticking anyone off. All right, so you're a manager of a medical device company,
I don't know anybody like that.
and you've got a salary range from X to Y. You're not gonna just continue to bang 2 to 3% increases year on year for infinity, because at some point, it's not competitive to overpay. I shouldn't say competitive. It's not feasible. It's not financially feasible to overpay for the position. You don't want to overpay for a position. You don't want to underpay for the position. You need to be in a range. And
Right,
no
and
matter
I
how
think-
long you've been here, because I believe in performance over years any day. So I didn't hear performance mentioned once, and that could be a differentiation between two people in the same position that have been here about the same amount of time. And I don't know if that's how it works here, but
So I think one of the things that Don is getting at is, through the chair, that I think on an ongoing, continuing basis, we look at the market and what's competitive. That's the
Right.
tools he's giving us, so that as long as you don't, with the adjustments, outpace the market, then I think you're in good shape. Because the market will, of course, naturally go up every single
well,
year
you'd
until.
adjust your
right.
ranges accordingly.
Correct.
It's not necessarily, fix them in 1980 and never change them.
No, and through you, Mr. Chairman, I mentioned earlier, one of the critical aspects of developing a plan is to giving you the ability to maintain the plan. All too often, studies are done like this. Towns approve a plan, but along with the plan being approved, they don't approve a process to maintain it. That won't happen here. The other issue I just want to quickly mention on you, because you mentioned the word performance, I want to assure you that, the very last step of the study, where you have a plan in front of you, one, you'll be comfortable knowing how it's been developed. And by the way, I mentioned the organizational structure being one of the checks and balances in determining grade levels. The other simple way to say that is that each grade level is meant to reflect a different level of responsibility, quote unquote. From entry level, let's say, to the most complicated, highest level of responsibility within the town of Dudley. And if you take your largest department, for example, whatever that might be, your highway department, your police department, wherever the most number of positions are, if you look at one of your particularly public safety departments, they already have well-defined different levels of responsibility. Believe me, the police chief is very familiar, very much aware, as are all the other members of the department. They know if you want to be so-called promoted from one position to another, particularly if that position is going to be paid more money, that other position, particularly if it's more higher compensation, is based on higher levels of responsibility. And that's all described and contained in their organizational structure. Well, the same principle will apply to all of your other non-union, the exact same principle. So we're not trying to invent the wheel here, just the opposite. Your public safety departments already have those levels of responsibility very well defined. You know them, so do they. And it's all agreed to. The process to move from one level of responsibility to another is not market-driven, right? It's primarily driven by different levels of responsibility. Same principle will apply to the non-union classification compensation plan that you'll see. So just keep in mind, approving the policy really is another way of saying different levels of responsibility, and we will give you information in very straightforward layman's terms that will explain to you what the different levels of responsibility are that are corresponding to the different grade levels, not the dollars and cents, okay? The dollars and cents will come into the process, but not until we first develop the grade level. So it's very much basically a two-step process. Grade levels, classification plan first, salary range is second. That's your basic plan. That's what we're going to ask the board to approve. With that plan approved, and it's really a tentative approval until you decide how you're going to spend the money, which again means hiring new employees as well as compensating current employees. So going forward, I can think, just as I've said many times, off the top of my head, there's probably at least 5 or 6, if not more, different ways to pay employees. One of them is based on performance. Another is based on cost of living. A third is based on years of service, and so on and so forth. There's lots of ways to pay employees money. All I'm suggesting to you today is that what I'm really trying to get the board to do when it's all said and done is to establish what are the values, and I think that's the key word to keep in mind in terms of paying positions and paying employees. What are the values of the town of Dudley with respect to paying positions and paying employees? We all understand that not every position is equal to the other. They're not all the same. They're not all equal in value or importance. Unfortunately, in the public sector, we're not used to talking about things like that. In the private sector, though, and you mentioned the example about the medical technician or whoever it was, they talk about values all the time. What's important to them as a company, and not all the positions are equally as important. Well, we know that goes on in the private sector. Well, with all due respect, it goes on in the public sector as well. We just don't talk about it. And so the process that I'm ultimately going to provide to you, really, and if you stop and think about it as a board, as the hiring authority, really what we're going to be asking you to do is to approve and establish what are the values of the town of Dudley with respect to how you want to pay your employees. And there's lots of ways to pay them, not just the way you've been doing it in the past.
Clear? Good. Terry?
I think I've got a good grasp of what you're doing and what we're going to get.
Good.
I'm sure I'll have questions once the document comes.
Great. The more the better. I welcome that. I really look forward to it. And again, one of my concerns and one of my reasons for wanting to come here tonight is to let you know what I'm going to be doing, ideally before I've done it. So if we've talked about anything this evening from a process standpoint that you're not comfortable with, either individually or collectively, please let us know. As I say to the employees, everyone should agree to the process, with no exception. And that includes other appointing boards as well. It's critically important. If there's one characteristic that I didn't mention at the beginning, that I've learned anything in having worked with municipalities on compensation for the last 20 years, the number one characteristic, by far, nothing comes close to it, is communication. And the importance of communication. You have an issue here in the town of Dudley, it's a lack of communication. I'm not trying to be negative or say, you know, obviously you've been paying employees in positions for quite a long time. All I'm suggesting to you is that in order to do it more effectively, do it better, so to speak, better means consistent, better means competitive. It doesn't mean necessarily, you know, based on what you can afford. There's lots of ways, again, to spend the money. So communication really becomes essentially the key to managing compensation effectively.
Paul, any questions?
I dare not.
Cal?
I just have a,
We've already paid for it, they ask them all.
All right.
I just have a question. So the three main points that you were talking about are longevity, market value, and pay rate. You know, as Mr. Johnson said, you know, we can't necessarily compare those three things to 1980. How do we make sure that those are, these numbers are always consistently viable and are accurate? Who's in charge of that? And do you have a preferred method of how we can maintain it in the best way possible? Like, as you said, you know, some towns kind of struggle with that. Is there a preferred method on how to get from point A to point B with maintenance?
Well, there isn't one way to do this, obviously. I think the preferred method is the way that's going to work best for the town of Dudley. Suffice it to say, though, that the policies that I'm going to give you, which I mentioned earlier, really do nothing more than describe to you what we've done in conducting this study. Will include also a recommendation relative to who is responsible for what, from the Board of Selectmen to perhaps other appointing authorities, to the role of a department head, to the role of employees, and so on. All the parties to compensation should have a defined role and/or responsibility. The town administrator mentioned a few minutes ago that one of the recommendations as it relates to collecting market data, once again, is to establish a process so that you're always constantly testing the market to make sure that you are, in fact, one, working with current information or data, and secondly, you're able to use that data for you to decide how competitive you want to be in the marketplace. So you'll make that conscious decision as a board from one period of time to another. If during the year, for example, you have a problem filling a vacancy, or you reach the end of a year and now you're hiring new employees, let's say, and you want to determine, well, what's a competitive rate of pay to hire a brand new employee? You'll now have that information available to you to help you make the decision that's in your best interest. Right now, you haven't had that information. So you've had to kind of, you know, wing it in a sense, or not necessarily do it consistently. Just the opposite should happen going forward. It should give you the comfort level to know that when you make that tough decision relative to what to start a new employee at, the process will require you to look at how you're currently paying your employees, where they are today when you make that decision to hire a new employee, and then secondly, how you want to deal with all of your employees in a consistent way to pay them going forward. Doesn't mean you're going to pay them the same way. That's not what I meant. All right? That's a decision you'll make. But the bottom line is, and that is what I alluded to when I said there's lots of ways to spend the money. By the way, just to, you know, what's in the back of my mind, I hesitate. Well, let me just throw this out. One of the hardest things I find to get towns to stop doing is what apparently you've been doing, and that is giving everybody a percentage across the board increase. For the record, I never recommend that. That's not an equitable way to do it. And there's lots of reasons why I'm saying that. That is an incredibly difficult thing to get cities and towns to stop doing. That's what I'm giving you a heads up to. I've already given you one of my recommendations. Giving everyone a percentage across the board increase is not the most equitable. It certainly isn't the most consistent way to do it, but yet that's the way I know you've been doing it in the past, which is true of 90% of the municipalities out there. It's just not, I think, in your best interest, frankly, to continue to do that. Without getting into a lot of detail, but suffice it to say that collecting market data, you don't have to survey, by the way, every single position every single year, so I'm not talking about a lot of work or time that it takes to do that. Just the opposite. I think clearly your town administrator position is the principal position that I would think you would assign there, but that's a decision you'll make with regard to who's going to be responsible for what, which again includes the Board of Selectmen.
We also have which was adopted a few years back, a merit pool where
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that.
self-evaluations,
Uh-huh.
departmental evaluations, previous administrator, I'm sure Mr. Ruda will be doing it too. Excuse me, meet with the personnel board.
Mm-hmm.
And those are above and beyond any across the board. Some people get
Right,
1, some get 0, some get 1.5,
right.
which
right.
is,
Well, that's
Well-
good. I'm glad to hear that. I wasn't aware of that. And I'm glad to hear that, you know, you've had opportunities to do things, you know, sometimes a little bit differently.
right, there's no guarantee. Some people have gotten 0s.
Sure.
For
Right.
whatever reason that we don't go into, but.
Right. And by the way, just to give you another little heads up about ranges, because I know that phrase came up a little bit earlier. One of my objectives in developing ranges, by the way, is you don't have to be at the top of the range to be paid competitively. That's not what you're going to see. That's one of the mistakes, frankly, in my opinion, that municipalities make in defining the word competitive. You don't necessarily have to be at the top of the range in order to meet that standard, meet that criteria. In fact, I don't think it works to your advantage to say, well, when you reach the top, you max out. You asked me earlier about maximum pays. Well, I can't see how that's a win for the employer to say to the employee, this is as high as you go. Now, in effect, you decide that. But all I'm suggesting is that in defining that word competitive, you're going to see a process that doesn't require the employee to be at the top of the range in order to meet that standard. So there's always ideally room to grow. The question is how. And that's really the, you know, the big sort of $64,000 question type of thing that, you know, hopefully, you know, we'll be able to answer.
I'm just going to quickly summarize, and I don't speak for the board, but this isn't the first time we've discussed this, and I think a lot of the board members, myself included, look forward to the end result, and we struggle as to get to the process because no two towns are alike.
Right.
And you just said it perfect. You don't want to be at the top of the range because it's not fair to compare. Well, we just hired Jonathan for a town administrator. We got our demographics, we had our pay range, we made it work. Now, would that work in a neighboring town? Probably not. You know, or adjoining town or a close town.
Right. Right.
That's the problem too, you know. A lot of times people will say, well, see what this job's paying? Yeah, but that job might have 40,000 people in their town, we have 11.
Right.
You know, your budget, that budget might be 100 million, where a tenth of that, or whatever, you know, however the numbers work out.
Sure.
So that's, I think we're all looking forward to seeing the end result, whatever the criteria.
No, I
gets us to
appreciate that.
point.
Again, I think you can appreciate why operational criteria become so important
Right.
to deal with issues like you were just mentioning.
To me, I think that's the most important, understand.
Can I be devil's advocate for 1 second, Mr. Chairman? The converse, look at that, what you just stated was that you may have a manager in any department in another city or town that has 15 or 16 support staff under him or her versus a manager in another town that does all of those responsibilities with 2 or 3 support staff. Throwing it out there.
Right?
See
No,
if Paul will bite.
that's what I'm saying, no two positions are the same, that's for sure.
And again, it gets back to why just relying on market data becomes so unreliable.
Excellent. Oh, we certainly appreciate you coming in.
My pleasure.
We look forward
meeting
to
with you
it.
again, about a month or
Sure.
so.
We'll be here.
You know, I should have also.
After Mr. Bragg
but
gets
the
the words.
cooperation, I'd be remiss if I didn't say before I leave, that in all seriousness, both your town administrator as well as the real person running this, Michelle, they've both been incredibly cooperative, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Like to hear good things.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Jacobs. Next up, 10C. The aforementioned John Breyer. Discussion regarding APR, Agricultural Preservation Restriction Process. Good evening, Mr. Breyer.
Good evening, gentlemen. Michelle.
I know better than say brief to you, so I won't even say it.
No, the audience told me I have 5 minutes before the umbrella stick comes out and grabs me by the neck and pulls me out of here.
We have Oscar music piped in.
Exactly.
Ready to go.
The reason why I'm here is in regards to APR land. I'm seeking a vote from the Board of Selectmen tonight to establish a process to identify APR land in the permitting process. And I'll tell you the reason why we're doing this. The state of Mass reached out to me a couple of months ago and about APR land, that there was a farmer or two that was considering putting their land into the APR bank. And I guess the way it works today, and it's a change from past years, is if a piece of land is valued at $100,000 that a farmer has, all right, the state comes in, does an appraisal, and if that piece of land is appraised at $100,000, the state gives the farmer 80% of that value for the APR land. And what the APR does is basically the farmer agrees to sell their development rights to it. So you can't have a subdivision on it and all this other stuff. So on a $100,000 piece, the state would only give them $80,000. Now, because Dudley adopted the right to farm bylaw, that is now 5% more. So now the state gives 85% of that $100,000. All right, so the farmer now is guaranteed an extra $5,000 from the state. Because the town of Dudley established an agricultural commission, the state is now given another 5%. So now, because we have a right to farm bylaw and an ag commission, the state gives that farmer $90,000 instead of $80,000. If you approve this tonight, the state will come up with another 5%. And so now, adding that $100,000 piece, the state is going to give that farmer $95,000. You following me so far? All right. And all the state's looking to do is they've had a problem identifying in their book of APR lands what's going on with the APR land across the Commonwealth. There's a lack of communication between the towns and the state. So the state said, okay, look, if a town agrees to establish a process where during the permitting process, someone states whether their land is APR or not, and then communicates that with the state, we'll give another 5% towards that APR land, and the town doesn't have to come up with that. All right, so that's how we get that extra 5%. So all I'm looking to do here, and this directly benefits any farmer in Dudley who's looking to possibly put their land into APR, is have the Board of Selectmen just simply do a motion. I came up with a simple one-page form that I thought would be the simplest way to do it. And all it basically says, I, the landowner, swear that the property located at this address is either enrolled in APR land or it's not enrolled. And I figured if we put this in the building department, the planning board, you know, the permitting process, and just have the owner sign off on it, that's all that's necessary for us to meet that state's obligation of having a process in place. If you don't want the form, I would even vote to say, okay, yes, the town of Dudley, is in support of establishing a process to identify APR land in the permitting process, subject to the town administrator working out the proper procedures with the various boards. You could even keep it open-ended like that, and that would be sufficient for the state as well. But by voting on this, the Ag Commission did vote, it was unanimous, and now it's the Board of Selectmen's vote on this, and as soon as you do, I call the state tomorrow, and Dudley is bumped from the 90% category into the 95% category for APR reimbursement to the farm owners.
So this doesn't put the property in APR, it just
Nope.
states that the landowner is saying it is or it isn't.
That's all they want to know.
And who verifies it?
It would be the state technically, because once they fill this out, so what would happen is, and this is where the process where John could work with the various boards, I think the simplest thing is that if someone does say that their land isn't enrolled in APR, where that's simply forwarded to either the Ag Commission or to Michelle, and Michelle just faxes it over or emails over MDAR, they'll give us a contact, and just says, yeah, a permit's just come up for this APR land. That's all the town's obligation is simply flag it and notify them during the process. Doesn't require us to do anything else. The state will simply update their records,
Now, how does the payment come back to the property owner?
the state themselves. So
Like a one-time payment, like the full amount?
yeah, exactly. So my understanding is let's just say there's one of the pieces in Dudley does go through the APR process. It's a long process. It could take 2 years because the state's got to go put it through the federals. Federals got to, sign off on it as well. But at the end of the day, what would happen is it's basically the state issues a check to the landowner as if they had just bought the property. So using that $100,000 piece, that example that I used,
They buy out the redevelopment.
yeah, they would give a check to the farmer for $95,000.
So unlike APR, we give APR benefit on tax. Would that person, if they change their mind, have to pay the value back to the state?
I don't know a lot about APR land. I'm not a farmer, I'm a city boy. The state had approached me on this.
I guess what
To
I'm
try-
getting at, John, is the town won't be on the hook, like your $100,000 example. If 5 years later, the person says, oh, I want to develop it, the town's not on the hook at any point to say, oh, you're going to pay some kind of money back to the state, or,
Yeah, this doesn't change the APR process at all. And what the Act Commission has asked, that we're trying to establish with MDAR right now, is for them to actually set up an informational session here in Dudley on APR land. And that would be a wonderful, wonderful question to ask them about, okay, how does someone buy back the development rights? What's the whole process and everything else? This doesn't do any of that. All this does is puts an extra 5% into the farmer's pocketbook that the state cuts a check to them for.
lessens the town's obligation by 5%.
Exactly. Now, let's just say a piece of APR land does come up for $100,000, and the state now wants $5,000 in that same example from the town. If the town doesn't vote that $5,000, the farmer's just going to get that 95%. Now, there are other nonprofits that could step up, such as the Dudley Conservation Land Trust, and they could come up with the other $5,000 if they wanted to.
And pay the farmer, pay the landowner.
Yeah, pay the landowner. But if the town decides not to contribute, at least that farmer would be guaranteed 95% payment from the state. If we didn't have the right to farm bylaw and the Ag Commission, they would have only gotten 80%.
So the town has to vote to release any funds that
Yeah.
doesn't equal 100.
Yeah, so let's just take, for example, this piece that may be coming up in the next, 18 months. What would happen is the state's going to do their appraisal. They're going to come up with a monetary value, and let's just say it's $200,000 for this piece. Well, at a 95% contribution rate, right, they're going to say, okay, we'll give the farm owner $190,000, and the town has to come up with $10,000. Now, if the town doesn't vote, first it's got to be voted on at town meeting, right, and then the Board of Selectmen. And let's just say at the end of the day, the town doesn't vote to come up with the $10,000. The farmer will still get 95%, a check cut by the state for that 95%.
So one last question for me, and then I'm...
Sure.
I guess what I'm looking at too is I don't want to lead anybody down the path that they're guaranteed that money, because like, as you just said, if the town doesn't vote it, you know what's gonna happen? Someone's gonna get up at town meeting and say, I'm only getting 95, I should get the extra 10,000, 20, and if 51 out of 100 say, yeah, we agree,
Well,
but there's no guarantee, there's no...
as of now, the only guarantee is that the state will give them 90%. If you vote on this tonight, now you're going to guarantee that the state's going to give them 95%.
And is it gonna be like the Quinn bill someday? The state says we're not gonna fund this anymore, so the town's on the hook?
They certainly could. They could stop it tomorrow. But while it's there, you might as well take advantage of it and get your farmers an extra 5% guaranteed from the state.
Mr. Johnson? What's your hand up, sorry.
No, sorry.
Gary?
Do you know, is there a requirement that the land be farmed, or is this just a program to keep it from being developed?
My understanding is it's programmed to keep it from being developed. But again, I'm looking forward to the MDAR coming out and having that full-blown workshop on APR land, because again, I'm not qualified to really answer
I'm
the
just
specifics of it. Yeah.
curious.
Everything I've been told about it has been basically selling the development rights, so that on a 100-acre piece, right, you don't have 100 homes going up there with, 200 more kids entering the school system and everything else, and, the infrastructure, that it's better to keep those pieces open and agricultural.
You remember?
I think they've got more questions than answers. So the whole APR program sounds like there's risk there, right? So you tie up land in basically development purgatory. You've got unknown requirement possibly if the state backs out of the program. I just you know, this seems too easy.
It is exactly as easy as it seems here. We're not discussing the APR program changes to it, any modifications.
No, but the 5% more risk.
There is no risk. There's absolutely no risk. Right now, the farmer is guaranteed 90%. Whether you do nothing or, if we walk out of here and nothing gets accomplished, if a farmer's piece of land is valued at $100,000, they're going to walk away with 90%. All right? If you simply approve that someone during the permitting process has to identify their land as being APR or not, you're giving that farmer an extra 5%. It's that easy. It's that easy.
It goes back to the question. The state doesn't know which land is APR?
I mean,
They do, but they don't have a communication link between their offices in Boston and the local towns on understanding who is doing what on APR land. They're looking to increase the communication between the towns and their offices. And for simply establishing a process, you're giving the farmer 5% more. You're not.
Mr. Chairman, is there a deadline on this that we have to vote tonight, or we have to ask the board to take a vote? Because, as Mr. Johnson said, holy cow on the questions, right? They're gonna pay 5% more to figure out something that their commission voted on. I mean, their commission has to vote to accept APR land. What, did they lose the record? They're gonna give an extra 5%? And is there a shortage of APR land in Dudley that I'm not aware of, or are we incentivizing this? I mean, I'm not opposed to helping the farmers out, but first, they gotta be legit little farmers to get the help. I don't know what the tax ramification is. The treasurer's back there. Maybe he could help us with switching over to APR land or classifying something as APR land. Before I can make a recommendation to the board, I need to know more about this. I'm happy to have them vote on it. I think it'll fail, based on the reaction here tonight, it's gonna fail. I'd rather take a look at this first and at least be able to make a recommendation on it.
If I could, Mr. Chairman, because I think the train's run off the track. We're trying to make something much more complicated than it is. Again, whether you do nothing at all here tonight, if a farmer decides to put their land into APR, it has nothing to do with you.
Yep.
The state is only going to pay them 90% as of now. And that's because we
agree
did a
with
right
that
to farm
100%.
bylaw and the Ag
So
Commission.
they get paid 90% of the land value?
Of the appraised value, that they hire an appraiser, just like a real estate agent, and they appraise the value of the land.
The state incentivizes farming, with the key word incentivizing farming, by buying the development rights for APR land. That was, I don't know, I think it was passed in the 70s.
Right, that's the actual APR process.
That's the APR process.
Right.
We're not talking about changing any of that. We're not talking about putting any land into APR here. If you vote on simply, in our permitting process,
They get $5,000 more.
5% more.
5%.
All right, on a $200,000 piece, that's $10,000. Simply voting to put a process in place in our local permitting process that a person has to identify whether or not their land is APR or not. A simple statement gives that farmer an extra 5%, guaranteed.
Jim,
It's that simple,
I'd love to see that in writing from the state.
okay?
I
That's
I
fair
believe-
fair
I-
enough.
I believe you.
I don't do
so far
this
I've got an
because I
e-
have
I got
a
an
lot of extra time on my hands. I do this because I try to help out people who
John,
really want help
John,
out.
I've got an email from you that said this is true.
And
I want to believe.
have I ever
wanna
said
believe there's
anything
no
that has been
ramifications.
false?
I want to believe there's no ramifications to this, and you said you're not fully aware of the APR program.
Fair enough. I will get an email from
How could I possibly
MDAR.
vote that? Am I tying a noose? I don't know.
Paul,
Yeah, I don't know what's going on, other than the fact that For some reason, John's mic is breaking in and out, and I'm only picking up part of it. However, there are enough unanswered questions that it would seem to me that I should pose this question. Does the board want to get advice from town council before it takes a position on this issue?
Probably,
Because there are enough unanswered questions that I think we ought to have answered before we make a final decision.
I would say probably at a minimum, because I was thinking the same thing. That's why I'm glad somebody else asked the question. We're not boxed into voting for this tonight. It's not like a deadline. It doesn't have to be done by February 11th.
No, it was so simple enough. I just thought, man, quick in and out, this was a no-brainer. But, you know, you could
I hope
seek
it
the
is.
advice.
You know what?
Yeah.
What's an old saying? It's too good to be true, it probably is. Al,
This would line up, Mr. Chairman, with exactly how, this would be a Commonwealth program if I ever saw one.
oh, God, yeah.
Absolutely.
Al,
I just have two things. So the first thing is are we obligated to pay, let's say in both examples, if we don't do this, APR land thing, are we obligated to pay that 10%? Or if we do the APR thing, are we obligated to pay that 5%? Are we obligated to pay that margin that the state missed?
Through the chair.
good.
No, the state recommends that you do it. If the town decides not to, the farmer would simply not get that 5 or 10%.
It wouldn't
Okay.
get the full value.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's my biggest fear, is if we go to a town meeting, and I'll use myself as an example. If I owned a piece of land and I wanted an APR, state goes, if we've approved this at some point, state goes to 95, and then they go to town meeting, and people say no, of course I'm gonna get up and say, well, why can't I get the 100% value? I don't want, I agree with everybody, until I get absolute proof that it's the right thing to do, because you know someone's not gonna get the vote at town meeting, and it's gonna be our fault because they didn't get the 100.
Isn't that their risk by going into this program? Like, aren't they gonna know, I could not potentially get this 100%? They need to be okay with that because it's their decision to go into this program.
Exactly.
A lot of people go in hoping for the best intentions and the best results, and sometimes it doesn't happen.
I mean, but we can't necessarily take that personally as a board because it was their decision to say, okay, I'm gonna sign this paper today. I might not get that 100% that I'm looking for.
Right, I'm trying to make this come out nice, I'm not saying that, until you're there, Al, until someone sits there and says, how could you vote against me when you know I deserve it? You'll
Yeah.
find out. In a perfect world, yeah, it's like when you get hired for a job. You're getting paid X. You come in and you draw your first check and you say to yourself, boy, I'm working way harder than for this money. I deserve more. But you took the job at a certain rate. Or you come in and you say, boy, I'm really skating because I'm getting a lot of money for a job I can do in my sleep.
Mm-hmm.
And people still come back and say, I know I took the job and you told me here's my pay, but I think I deserve $2.80 an hour more. And then we're stuck picking up the pieces, and they say, well, you don't appreciate what I'm doing because you're not paying me. You know what I'm saying? So you're
Yeah.
actually sitting there and someone says to
No,
you,
I fully understand what you're saying, and it does make sense.
I mean, we go through with developers, John.
Oh, yeah.
Some of us served on the planning board. We have guys that put performance bond, water sewer knows, they put up bonds. They get money back, or the bonds get reduced, and then the roads fall apart, and then we go back to these people and say, your private road's junk, and the guy says, oh, that's LLC doesn't exist anymore, so sorry. But you know, you're the same guy. But yeah, but that LLC doesn't exist anymore, and they come to us and say, fix my road, plow my road,
No,
fix my pump station.
Mr. Chairman, I
Don't
think...
do it, people think you're not doing your job, you know what I
Yeah.
mean?
I do agree with what you're saying, and it does make sense both ways. But my second point is, until we get more adequate information that suits Mr. Johnson's needs, Mr. Chairman's needs, whatever, could we table this to another meeting?
That's probably, I think, is gonna be the end result.
Is that feasible?
Oh, definitely. Well, as John said, we're not boxed into a time frame. I mean, if we had absolutely positively vote tonight, you know, the result may be different, may not, but if we can have time to get more information and bring
Yeah.
John back, I'm sure John can
Yeah.
contact whoever contacted him and get more information.
If you're tied up, Michelle and I will do it, it's fine.
Fair enough. You know
Yeah.
what? It'd be wonderful. I'll give you the contact at MDAR. You can get the paperwork you want. That'll confirm everything we talked about. Mr. Chair, you know, the argument about you going, you know, at town meeting, someone going up there and saying, geez, you know, why can't I get 100%? You walk away from this tonight, they're only getting 90%. You vote for this, they get 95%.
No, I understand, but they're gonna say, could be $1 million piece of property, now you're talking some real cash. You know, and you know, John, you've been there, people
Yeah.
get up and they say, hey, wait a minute, I thought my road's getting approved tonight, and we say, well, no, not really. And then they go, you didn't do your job.
Mr. Chairman, just so I'm clear on, if we're gonna be looking at this, and Mr. Breyer, if I'm not getting this, you just correct me.
Sure.
The town is incentivizing farmers or people who own APR land, right? To sign off that they actually own APR land in order to get an additional 5% on the development rights. Whether it was placed in APR 20 years ago or whether it was placed in APR 20 days ago.
Exactly.
It totals out at 95. If
Exactly.
we do this.
Any piece of land that is in APR, if a person's going for a building permit or whatever,
Yeah.
would just have to state, is the land enrolled in APR or is it not? And if it is enrolled, the state just wants to be given a heads up.
So, but there's no requirement that before they get their additional 5%, they actually see if it's being used for the intended purpose?
Exactly.
There's no requirement. It's
Nope.
just, here you go.
As soon as you adopt this, Dudley goes in their tier rating from a 90% reimbursement rate to the farmers to 95%.
I guess I understand it, but I guess I'm not getting the premise behind it, because it doesn't make any sense to me. I would think that they would use this to figure out, somebody's using it for the intended purpose, let's give them an extra 5% and incentivize it. But just because of what they don't know who has APR land?
That's
It's a state in their federal program.
It's
That's like.
the government, they're here to help.
Mr. Sigenovich.
Is this program retroactive, meaning if someone,
No,
no. So whatever they got in 1992, they got, and that's it?
exactly. This would be only for new APR applications that the state buys out the development rights. Instead of being paid, guaranteed 90% from the Commonwealth, they'll be paid 95% for adopting this process.
I think if I can speak, well, I won't speak on behalf of anyone. If I'm hearing people right, I think they're afraid that there might be a hook with this, meaning, you know, nothing's free. What's the hook?
I'm afraid there's a cinder block.
And you know what? If there's no hook, if this is it,
It's too good to be true.
Yeah, to the chair.
Mr. Johnson, sorry.
You know, if this is just, 5% on the few applications get approved, that 5% and the state gets free data collection, that don't almost, make sense in my head, right? Because let's say only a few of these.
But it's already skewed data if it's an empty field, right?
Sure, but if it's just simple data collection,
Yeah.
and they pay, it's 5% of the few in the state that get approved every year, right? That almost makes sense, because, how much does it
Right.
cost to go get that information otherwise?
Right.
So, it almost makes sense, but I just don't see the backup information that says it.
But
I'm not gonna vote on an email.
The flip side to that is, they should already know what's an API.
They know it's an APR, they just don't know who's asking for building permits on the APR land or who's doing improvements that may, they don't know what's happening at a local level in regards to their APR land.
oh, the fog's clearing now. Okay.
So all they want is that any kind of permit, that if it's flagged as APR, that it be sent over to them. They'll do whatever they have to do on their part.
You can get an answer pretty quick on this, I would think, huh?
Yeah, we can get an answer pretty
You
quick.
come back to the
Maybe I'll
next
have,
meeting?
maybe I'll get it.
I can't, I won't be able to be back here for at least a month. So, but if you get the answers you want and you see what a wonderful opportunity this is to put an extra 5% in the farmer's pocket, feel free to vote on it without me being present. My 5 minutes is up, these guys are gonna ring me.
No, you're all right, John. This is easy. Usually go way longer than this.
I thought this was gonna be a 2-minute.
It was until you said, if we vote tonight, vote. Just kidding. Paul, you all set?
Yeah, I just think, I don't know if you want to memorialize this into the minutes by tabling it with the request that the town administrator have a discussion with town council and get advice on the issue.
Yeah, I don't think we need a vote. We'll just instruct the administrator to do it, and he'll get it done.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Paul. John, thank you.
Thanks for your time.
Always good to see you. Any further questions for Mr. Breyer? Hearing none. 10D, presidential primary warrant, vote and sign. What's the board's pleasure?
Mr. Chairman, I move that we sign the presidential primary warrant.
Motion made by Mr. Sigenovich, seconded by Mr. Johnson. Any further questions or concerns? Hearing none. Roll call vote. Mr. Sigenovich.
Kerry Sigenovich, aye.
Paul.
Paul Joseph, aye.
Mr. Johnson.
Jay Johnson, aye.
Stephen Sullivan, aye. Unanimous. Sign the original.
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah. Yes, sir.
I accidentally, and I meant to bring this up, and I should have, but I didn't. There was a flaw in our minutes that that I had discussed with Mr. Joseph, and we accepted those minutes, so I was hoping we could reconsider accepting the minutes until we've had a chance to correct that.
Which one was that? The regular session?
No, it was the regular session.
Yes, regular session.
Yes, sir.
What's the,
May I, Mr. Ruda?
go ahead, Paul.
The minutes say that John Marcy came in at 7:05 and that he moved to reconsider the vote. Well, he can't make that motion because he was not present and voting in the affirmative. I think what happened was, Sully, that you actually made the motion to reconsider that vote. We voted yes, I believe, to approve that, and then we took the vote with John present, and that was approved unanimously. If the board has a couple of options, we can change that by unanimous consent now without a vote, or you can go through the process of changing it by vote.
I think, Mr. Chairman, in the absence of Mr. Marcy, we should just correct the record and accept that change by unanimous consent.
Yeah, because all right, now I see it now. Yeah, he definitely, he asked for it, but he did not make the motion. I think you're right, I believe I did.
Correct.
So what would you
No,
like,
he didn't make the motion.
so what would you like to do, Mr. Ruda?
Let's have Mr. Joseph suggest it. Let's have him walk us through that.
Paul,
Yep.
should we open up reconsideration of the minutes and amend them, or do you want to just,
You can do it either way. Whatever way, either way is clean, as long as the minutes actually reflect what happened.
so, instead of it where it's boldface, where it says John Marcy motion, it should say Stephen Sullivan motion?
Let me do this, Sully. Let me move, since I was in the affirmative, let me move to reconsider the vote to approve the minutes of our last public meeting. If that passes, then we can amend those minutes with the correct verbiage.
All right, so we have a motion to reconsider the minutes that were approved earlier tonight. Is there a second?
Second.
Second, Mr. Sigenovich. Further questions? Roll call vote. Mr. Sigenovich.
Kerry Sigenovich, aye.
Paul.
Paul Joseph, aye.
Mr. Johnson.
Jay Johnson, aye.
Stephen Sullivan, aye. Unanimous. Chair will entertain,
Yep.
go ahead,
Yep.
Paul. I was gonna say entertain a
I'd
motion.
like to move that the minutes be amended to state that the motion to reconsider that was made before John Marcy got there, that the motion to reconsider was made by Mr. Sullivan, You'll have to check the tape to see who seconded it, and that vote was made to reconsider, and then the vote was retaken with John present, and once again passed unanimously.
I second that.
Yeah, I think if we leave it with what Jay Johnson seconded, I believe he did.
Okay,
So, Chair, will
that's how I would amend the minutes so that they're accurate.
all right, Chair, will, ask for a second to Mr. Joseph's motion.
Second.
Multiple seconds. Any further questions or corrections? Hearing none. Roll call vote. Paul?
Paul Joseph, aye.
Gary?
Gary Siganovich, aye.
Jay?
Jay Johnson, aye.
Stephen Sullivan, aye, unanimous.
Thank you.
The amended,
All right, so John came
so
in.
they
Chair refused to
reconsidered approval
recognize.
of the minutes.
John,
Board member comments?
Sure.
Mr. Johnson?
So Saturday, Dudley Little League had a great fundraiser, raised a ton of cash for a great program. We've got a product of the program right here, Mr. Salonis, and his dad and I had coached for a few years there. I'm not sure about the scoring, but the team that won was donated the money back to the league, so that was great. And sign-ups are active, so keep an eye out.
Don't be shy. You can name the winners. I
Uh,
wouldn't. You
I
can.
believe it was Mr. Kamignani and a couple of good fellas.
You won't even give Mr. Siganovich the
Oh,
credit.
and Mr. Signevich and Mr. Mazzi was there, I believe, as well. So congratulations on the win as well.
Outstanding.
Thank you, sir.
Gary, comments?
I just want to echo what Mr. Johnson said. That was a great event. There were a lot of people there, a lot of money raised. It was a real sense of community where I've seen people that I haven't seen in a long time. It was a great event.
Mr. Serrano did a great job emceeing the event, too.
Oh, he definitely did. That's all I've got for now. Thank you.
Paul, anything you want to add?
Is Mr. Kamignani present?
Yes.
Rich did a great job in providing us information, which I had asked for, regarding all of our current insurance policies that we pay for.
Yep.
And I appreciate that. And I only had two quick questions. One, and again, I want to thank him for that data. Will we go out to bid for those that we are paying a premium for? And when will that public bidding be done? And the reason I ask that, and I know Rich knows this, and we all should know it, is that we all have a fiduciary responsibility to the people in town, and that's to periodically review the market. And I think Rich said that it's been somewhere around 10 years since we did test the market. So those are my two questions. Will we go out to bid? And does he have an idea when he would like to do that by?
Hang on, he's coming up.
They're already flicking the lights on me. I'm keeping everybody from things. So the question is,
Going out to bid.
we're going out to bid. Health insurance, no. As far as dental goes, I don't know what the renewal is going to be against trend. Life insurance, the plan already is property and casualty. I don't know what we can do as far as that goes, but already in the works to go and bid that out. I don't think 30B applies to things like bonds or anything like that. But property and casualty in its entirety, absolutely. Probably time. What do we do? Might be an opportunity, might be our current provider's going to wave goodbye. Who knows? It's insurance. So we'll see. The ball's already begun rolling on that. It's data-driven. Don't imagine that the town of Dudley's insurance is going to be any different than your personal life. You know, if you drive around and hit everything but the lottery, you can't go call any one of those commercials and get a 10% discount on things. They rate the town by their past history. But we'll do it, absolutely.
Is that good, Paul?
You know, unfortunately, once again, that mic is cutting out. It's not, I don't know what the problem is with it, but someone please tell me what the two answers are.
Basically, he said the health insurance, I think the town is pretty happy with.
Better? Knock somebody out of their seat.
One, Rich, that we belong to a consortium.
Yes, I'll take 30 seconds on that if I could. We belong to the Hampshire
What are the
Council of
ones-
Government.
I'm sorry. What are the ones that we will be going out to bid, and when do you expect to do them?
Property and casualty, it's a giant package. Property, casualty, law enforcement liability, public officials liability, inland marine, it's going to be the auto policy, it's going to be the auto injury, physical damage, workers' comp, IOD, the 111F coverage. Forgive me if I've forgotten something, but it's a package deal from one agent.
And it's in the works, right?
He said, Rich said it's in the works, like he's got the ball rolling, he said.
Well, my response is dynamite. Thank you.
Perfect.
10 seconds on the health insurance.
Good.
We're part of the Hampshire Council of Governments Insurance Trust, which means we don't exactly purchase insurance from Blue Cross. It's through a trust. It's a trust arrangement. So it's advantageous for them to go through and to be able to monitor certain cost factors and ultimately lower the price. We're selling things, or the trust is, excuse me. The trust is selling a product marked less than market value. It's going to be a 0 increase for the upcoming year. Blue Cross product is pretty solid, so, but each year they do their due diligence, given the loss data, given medical trend, prescription trend, and really whatever cost suppression they could. So we really need to opt out of something like that as opposed to bidding it separately.
Perfect. Thanks, Rich.
Thank you.
Departmental communications, police, water sewer, audiovisual.
Oh, no.
Anybody? Oh, yeah. Hey, student rep.
Yes, a lot of questions here. Make this one quick.
Yeah,
All right, fine.
I gave you a lot of leeway tonight.
I'm going to ask you a lot of questions now.
Okay. Central Mass Show Choir Festival is a big success. We had multiple show choirs come to our school and participate. The parent breakfast is tomorrow at 9 a.m. for incoming 8th graders, so parents can come and get information about our school. Kaylee O'Brien, Matt Clark, Cam Haynes, Alec Ambrosia, Maddie Marsh, and Kobe John Guillaume all signed their national letter of intent last week for D1 sports. That ranged from lacrosse to track to football. They're all great kids and very excited for them. March 22nd is the Winter Guard and Winter Percussion Home Show. That's in the gym in Shepherd Hill. Pioneer Teacher Day raised $750 for a student in need in our district, which was really fun. We got to pie a lot of the administration, a lot of teachers. Got to pie all the principals, so it was a great day. On March 11th, the Booster Club and PTO are doing a basketball fundraiser with the Harlem Wizards at 7 o'clock. The general admission is $12, reserved seating is $20, courtside is $35, and the tickets at the door are $15. And there's a learning showcase on March 26th where the school shows what we've been doing throughout the year. And winter break starts on Saturday 15th to the 23rd.
Much deserved.
Yes.
Accept the report as read.
Terry J. has a
I have a question.
Terry?
Yes, I do. I didn't want to say anything. I wanted to give you the opportunity. Weren't there two wrestlers that hit 100 wins?
Yes, there was Ethan Ayotte and Nolan Burke. I think I said Ethan Ayotte at our last meeting, but Nolan Burke actually got his 100th win between our meetings, so yes.
Excellent.
Indeed.
Outstanding. Before we motion to adjourn, the town treasurer is coming back up. Mr. Carmignani.
One of the founding members of the high school wrestling team.
How many
Absolutely.
wins you get?
What did I get?
How many wins?
Yeah, right. Nowhere close to 100, my
We
friend.
only got one season. That's all we had.
One season, proud to be there. Chris Starcheski was on that team, too.
Really?
Small world, yeah. Mr. Ruda opted out. Kerry and I were on
He was
there.
probably busy working the farm.
I had other things to work.
Anyway, we digress.
You all made the picture at the State House.
Yes, that was-
It's amazing, all those I didn't come up here to be embarrassed with pictures from the late 70s. Jim Whitney's up there, so
Just saying.
just absolute. So water, sewer, and excise bills are out. Everybody and their uncle is getting them. I've heard the curse words already and received a few terse emails, so it's out there. You'll see it on the sign at one point. Having everybody brace for it. If you've received a bill, you should be paying it or getting it abated in full, because the demands are gonna quickly follow the due date. Also, if you're driving around in a vehicle and don't have a bill, give my office a call. I'm happy to replicate a bill prior to the due date. Also, they're not public records, so you can't figure out where your ex-girlfriend lives.
Just because you didn't get one doesn't mean you
Sometimes
don't
when
know
I'm
one.
passing Burger King or Dunkin's, I say croissant, Big Mac. You know, I could use a bill.
Yeah,
Where can I get a bill?
Absolutely. The voodoo dolls are in full force tonight.
Yeah.
Pain in my lower back, pain in my ear. You know it.
Paul, any further comments?
No, sir.
Everybody good?
Yep.
Thanks, Al. At this point, the chair with the roll call to adjourn. Mr. Johnson.
Jay Johnson, aye.
Paul.
Paul Joseph, aye.
Mr. Sigenovich.
Kerry Sigenovich, aye.
Stephen Sullivan, aye. Have a good night, everyone. See you in a couple weeks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
See you
Paul.
later, Paul. Good night.